era was marked by a constant tension between the impulse for national renewal and the reality of a deeply entrenched partisan gridlock that often hindered the passage of traditional budgets and long-term planning. The geopolitical environment of 2025 and early 2026 remained volatile, with the United States maintaining its role as the primary supporter of democratic sovereignty in Eastern Europe in the Indo-Pacific, while simultaneously navigating the diplomatic complexities of the Middle East following a period of renewed conflict. These external pressures necessitated a continued modernization of the American military-industrial complex, shifting focus toward autonomous systems, cyber defense, and space-based assets, even as the nation debated the fiscal costs of global leadership. As the United States moved toward its semi-quincentennial in 2026, the anniversary served as a focal point for reflection on the durability of the Constitution and the evolving definition of the American dream in a world that bore little resemblance to the one envisioned by the founders or even the architects of the post-war order. The persistence of the American experiment was tested by the need to integrate these rapid technological and social changes into a cohesive national identity that could balance individual liberty with the collective requirements of a modern, interconnected, and increasingly diverse republic.
As the United States approached the July 4, 2026 semi-quinquentennial, the national psyche was characterized by a profound duality, balancing the celebratory commemoration of 250 years of independence against the logistical and existential pressures of a modern era defined by rapid cycle technological change and a restructured global order. This milestone anniversary triggered an extensive period of historical introspection, with federal commissions and local municipalities alike investing in the preservation of colonial-era sites and the digital archiving of the American experience. Yet this cultural reflection took place within a society that was increasingly looking toward a future dominated by synthetic intelligence and quantum computing. The economic landscape of early 2026 was marked by the continued integration of automated systems into the white-collar workforce, a transition that, while driving corporate efficiency, necessitated a radical reevaluation of post-secondary education and vocational training as traditional degree paths faced obsolescence. The Biden administration and the Congress of the mid-2020s found themselves compelled to address the algorithmic divide, where access to advanced computational resources became a new determinant of social mobility, mirroring the industrial divides of the previous century. In the energy sector, the Great Transition reached a critical mass as the cumulative effects of the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 began to manifest in a decentralized power grid heavily reliant on domestic solar, wind, and next-generation modular nuclear reactors. Though the extraction of rare earth minerals remained a point of geopolitical friction and environmental debate. This period of domestic restructuring was further complicated by the ongoing housing crisis, which prompted several states to pass sweeping land use reforms that curtailed local zoning authority in favor of high-density, transit-oriented development, a move that fundamentally challenged the 20th century American ideal of the suburban single-family home. On the international stage, the concept of integrated deterrence became the cornerstone of American defense policy, as the Department of Defense accelerated the deployment of unmanned surface vessels and AI-driven surveillance networks to maintain a presence in the South China Sea and the Arctic, the latter of which became a new frontier for resource competition as polar ice continued to recede. The relationship with the European Union remained stable but transactional, as both entities sought to establish a digital Atlantic framework for data privacy and AI regulation to counter the influence of authoritarian digital models. Within the borders of the United States, the legal and social ramifications of the 2024 and 2025 election cycles continued to reverberate, with the federal judiciary remaining a primary battleground for the interpretation of civil liberties in the age of pervasive data collection.
The migration patterns of the 2020s also became a defining feature of the era, as internal climate-driven migration from the increasingly arid Southwest and flood-prone coastal regions toward the Great Lakes and the Northeast began to shift political representation and economic centers of gravity. As the nation prepared for the 250th anniversary ceremonies in Philadelphia and Washington, D.C., the discourse was less about a unified dream and more about the management of a complex, pluralistic society that had survived civil wars, world wars, and pandemics, yet remained perpetually in the process of defining the limits of its own democracy. This period of American history was not marked by a singular climax, but by a persistent, grinding adaptation to a world where the speed of information often outpaced the capacity of 17th century institutional frameworks to process it, leaving the Republic in a state of constant, high-stakes evolution as it entered its third century of existence. The preparations for the semi-quinquentennial in 1776's successor state were inextricably linked to a broader, more systemic effort to modernize the physical and digital infrastructure of the United States, a project necessitated by the aging of the Eisenhower-era interstate system and the vulnerabilities of a localized power grid. In early 2026, the federal government initiated the National Connectivity Initiative, a massive public works program designed to install high-capacity fiber optic networks and redundant satellite link terminals across the rural Midwest and Appalachia, regions that had historically lagged in the digital economy. This effort was not merely about internet access, but was a strategic move to decentralize the American economy, allowing for the growth of Zoom towns and the revitalization of small-town main streets that had been in decline since the mid-20th century. However, this technological expansion occurred alongside a deepening crisis in the management of the nation's natural resources, particularly the Colorado River Basin, where a multi-state compact reached a breaking point as prolonged aridification forced mandatory water rationing for agricultural and municipal users across Arizona, Nevada, and California. This environmental pressure led to a significant shift in the American agricultural model, with venture capital flowing into vertical farming and precision agriculture technologies that promised to maintain caloric output with a fraction of the traditional water requirements. Politically, the year 2026 was characterized by a profound focus on the second century of the Constitution, with legal scholars and civil rights organizations debating the necessity of a modern Bill of Rights to address data privacy, biometric surveillance, and the rights of individuals in an era where predictive policing algorithms were becoming common in major metropolitan areas. The migratory patterns of the 2020s also became a defining feature of the era, as internal climate-driven migration from the increasingly arid Southwest and flood-prone coastal regions toward the Great Lakes and the Northeast began to shift political representation and economic centers of gravity. As the July 4th celebrations approached, the narrative of American history was being recontextualized in museums and schools to include a more comprehensive view of the diverse populations that had contributed to the nation's growth, moving away from a singular focus on the great men theory of history toward a more granular understanding of the labor movements, indigenous resurgences, and immigrant experiences that had defined the preceding 250 years. This historical reckoning was not without friction, as various states enacted conflicting curricula that reflected the ongoing culture wars, yet the overarching theme remained one of endurance and the capacity for institutional self-correction. The semi-quinquentennial itself served as a moment of temporary national pause, characterized by massive drone light shows in Philadelphia and silent reflection at the Lincoln Memorial, providing a brief respite from the relentless pace of a society that was simultaneously mourning its past and racing toward a future that remained obscured by the very technologies it had created. This chapter of the American story was one of managed complexity, where the primary goal of the state was no longer just growth or expansion, but the maintenance of social equilibrium in a world that felt increasingly fragile and interconnected.
The passing of the semi-quincentennial ceremonies in the summer of 2026 transitioned the United States into a period of post-anniversary pragmatism, as the symbolic unity of the celebrations gave way to the deep-seated logistical and demographic realities of the late 2020s. This era became increasingly defined by the Great Decoupling, a multifaceted process in which the American economy sought to insulate itself from global supply chain shocks, while simultaneously undergoing a domestic migration shift away from the Sun Belt toward the water belt of the Great Lakes and the Northeast. As record-breaking thermal anomalies persisted in the Southwest, the federal government initiated the National Water Security Act of 2026, a massive undertaking that funded the construction of industrial-scale desalination plants along the Gulf Coast and the Pacific, and established a federal framework for interstate water transfer rights that superseded century-old riparian doctrines. This legislative shift was mirrored in the energy sector by the Grid Modernization Mandate, which accelerated the decommissioning of the last coal-fired power plants in favor of a decentralized network of small modular reactors, SMRs, and advanced geothermal wells, particularly in the Intermountain West. Socially, the United States entered a phase of digital distillation, where the saturation of the information environment by hyper-realistic synthetic media led to a resurgence of localism and the physicality movement, characterized by a return to analog record-keeping in government archives and a revitalized emphasis on in-person civic participation. The labor market continued to oscillate under the pressure of pervasive automation, leading several states to experiment with universal basic services, providing subsidized housing, transport, and high-speed connectivity as an alternative to traditional cash-based welfare systems. The legal system, too, faced an unprecedented crisis of precedent, as the Supreme Court grappled with the definition of algorithmic due process, questioning whether decisions made by autonomous systems in credit lending, healthcare, and criminal sentencing could be held to the standards of the 14th Amendment. Internationally, the United States' role as the stabilizer of the commons was tested by the increasing militarization of the Arctic's northern sea route and the persistent threat of low-intensity cyber warfare against national infrastructure. The Department of State, under a new doctrine of constrained engagement, focused on the formation of the Critical Mineral Alliance, a strategic partnership with nations in South America and Africa designed to bypass the traditional dominance of the People's Republic of China in the processing of lithium and cobalt. As the 2020s waned, the American demographic landscape reached a significant tipping point with the majority-minority transition among the under-30 population, a shift that fundamentally altered the electoral map and forced both major political parties to abandon the binary ideological frameworks of the late 20th century in favor of multi-ethnic, class-based coalitions. This transformation was accompanied by a cultural new regionalism, as states like Texas, Florida, and New York began to function as autonomous laboratories of democracy, often passing divergent regulations on everything from carbon credits to biotechnological ethics. The persistence of the American state in this era was not characterized by a return to a perceived golden age, but by a grueling, iterative adaptation to a world of permanent volatility, where the foundational documents of the 1700s were constantly reinterrogated to provide a framework for a society that had moved beyond the limits of human-scale cognition and into a future defined by the complex interplay of biology, silicon, and the enduring quest for a more perfect union. The close of the 2020s and the transition into the 1930th year of the American Republic's third century saw the maturation of the interconnected era, a period where the traditional boundaries between the physical and digital and the state and the individual became increasingly porous. The year 2027 and 2028 were defined by the emergence of the cognitive economy,
as the Department of Labor officially recognized AI teaming as the dominant mode of employment across the financial, legal, and engineering sectors, a development that led to the passage of the National Labor Reskilling Act. This legislation, the largest federal investment in human capital since the 1944 GI Bill, established a network of technical institutes focused on the maintenance of automated systems and the management of bio-digital interfaces, marking a final pivot away from the traditional four-year liberal arts model that had dominated the 20th century. Simultaneously, the United States faced a profound constitutional challenge regarding the right to disconnect and the privacy of thought, as the Supreme Court heard arguments in cases involving the use of neural monitoring technology in the workplace, ultimately ruling in a narrow 5-4 decision that the Fourth Amendment protection against unreasonable searches extended to the internal biological data of citizens. This judicial pivot occurred against a backdrop of continued environmental realignment, as the Great Migration North intensified. Formerly stagnant cities along the Great Lakes, such as Buffalo, Cleveland, and Duluth, experienced a massive influx of capital and population, leading to a Rust Belt renaissance that shifted the center of American political gravity toward the north-central region for the first time in over a century. This demographic shift necessitated the Continental Infrastructure Accord of 2028, a tri-national agreement between the United States, Canada, and Mexico to integrate high-speed rail and energy corridors, effectively creating a North American super-region capable of competing with the unified markets of Eurasia. In the realm of energy, the successful commercialization of inertial confinement fusion at several domestic pilot plants by 2029 signaled the beginning of the end for the fossil fuel era, though the political fallout in traditional oil-producing states like Texas and Alaska led to a series of transition tensions that required federal intervention to manage the resulting economic displacement. Internationally, the United States' foreign policy evolved into a doctrine of technological containment, as the State Department led a coalition of democratic nations in establishing the Critical Shield, a series of trade barriers and security guarantees designed to prevent the proliferation of offensive autonomous weaponry by non-state actors and rival powers. This period also saw the Outer Space Sovereignty Act, in which the United States asserted its right to protect its orbital assets and lunar mining claims against encroaching interests, marking the formal extension of the Monroe Doctrine into the cislunar environment. Domestically, the social fabric of the nation was further tested by the truth crisis, as the proliferation of hyper-realistic AI-generated historical revisionism led to the establishment of the National Bureau of Information Integrity, a nonpartisan agency tasked with the cryptographic authentication of government records and public broadcasts. As the 2030s dawned, the American project was characterized by a paradoxical state of high-tech localism, where the global reach of the nation's technology was balanced by a return to decentralized state-led governance models that allowed for widely divergent social experiments in everything from basic income to environmental stewardship. The persistence of the Union in this volatile environment was no longer taken for granted, but was viewed as a continuous act of negotiation between a diverse, technologically integrated populace and a 250-year-old institutional framework that was systematically being re-engineered to survive the complexities of a post-humanist age.
The decade of the 2030s initiated the era of the biological republic, a period where the traditional American focus on industrial and digital infrastructure transitioned into a deep systemic integration of biotechnology, synthetic ecology, and the ethical management of the human genome. By 1831 and 1832, the federal government, under the National Biosecurity and Ethics Accord, began grappling with the emergence of personalized medicine and germline editing, technologies that promised to eradicate hereditary diseases but threatened to create a new biological class divide.
This period saw the Supreme Court issue the landmark genome sovereignty ruling, which asserted that an individual's genetic code was protected under the Fourth and Fifth Amendments, preventing corporations from patenting naturally occurring human DNA sequences and establishing the right to biological privacy. Simultaneously, the physical landscape of the United States underwent a radical transformation as the Great Reforestation Project took hold across the Great Plains and the Appalachian Corridor. Using advanced carbon-sequestering silviculture, the Department of the Interior aimed to create climate buffers to mitigate the increasingly volatile weather patterns that had begun to destabilize the nation's interior. These ecological efforts were mirrored in the blue economy of the coastal states, where massive kelp farms and artificial reef systems were deployed to protect against sea level rise, while providing a new source of sustainable biomass for the burgeoning bioplastics industry. Politically, the 2030s were defined by the rise of the Synthesis Party, a multi-ethnic coalition that sought to bridge the gap between rural traditionalism and urban technocracy through a platform of restorative federalism, which advocated for the return of significant administrative power to the state and local levels, provided they met federal standards for carbon neutrality and data transparency. This era also witnessed the final collapse of the traditional automotive industry, as the mobility as a service, or MaaS model, became the standard, with autonomous hydrogen-powered transit pods replacing private vehicle ownership in over 80% of American municipalities. This transition led to the Urban Reclamation Act, which funded the conversion of millions of acres of former parking lots and highway interchanges into public parks and high-density vertical housing, effectively ending the century-long era of suburban sprawl. Internationally, the United States entered into the Pacific-Atlantic Fusion Treaty, a comprehensive security and economic bloc that integrated the democratic nations of the Americas, Europe, and the Indo-Pacific into a single seamless trade zone designed to marginalize the influence of the few remaining authoritarian digital states. This period also saw the first permanent American settlement on Mars, the Artemis III base, which, while a source of immense national pride, sparked a renewed domestic debate over the allocation of federal funds toward space exploration versus the urgent needs of the water-belt cities. As the 2040s approached, the American identity was being reshaped by the longevity revolution, as breakthroughs in cellular rejuvenation extended the average productive lifespan of citizens to over 100 years, forcing a total restructuring of the American retirement system and the concept of career phases. The 2030s ended not with a single crisis, but with a sense of dynamic equilibrium, as the nation finally began to see the tangible results of its half-century-long struggle to adapt to the post-carbon world, leaving the Republic in a state of cautious optimism, anchored by its ancient constitutional principles, but propelled by a level of technological mastery that would have been indistinguishable from magic to its founders. The transition into the mid-2040s and early 2050s, a period historians now refer to as the era of systemic integration, was defined by a profound realignment of the American social contract as the nation grappled with the long-term consequences of the longevity leap and the full-scale emergence of artificial general intelligence. By 2045, the year often cited as the technological singularity in popular discourse, the United States had fundamentally restructured its labor economy to accommodate a workforce where nearly 40% of traditional cognitive and manual tasks were managed by autonomous systems, leading to the enactment of the National Opportunity Grant, a hybridized version of universal basic income that tied federal stipends to mandatory participation in human-centric services such as elder care, environmental restoration, and civic education.
This period saw the silver tsunami reach its demographic apex as breakthroughs in senolytic therapies and mRNA-based regenerative medicine significantly delayed the onset of age-related infirmity, resulting in a society where 1 in 4 Americans was over the age of 65, yet remained functionally active in the professional and social spheres. This longevity revolution necessitated the Intergenerational Accord of 2047, a comprehensive reform of the Social Security and Medicare systems that raised the flexible retirement age to 82, while introducing life cycle credits that allowed younger citizens to front-load their retirement benefits for mid-career educational pivots. Politically, the 2040s were marked by the dissolution of the traditional two-party binary into a more fluid multi-caucus system, as regional interests in the thriving water belt of the Great Lakes clashed with the resilient West over federal allocations for massive geoengineering projects such as the Great Plains Carbon Sink and the Southwest Desalination Corridor. Internationally, the United States maintained its role as the anchor of the Global Democratic Network, a decentralized alliance that used blockchain-verified trade protocols to bypass traditional financial gatekeepers, even as it entered a state of steady-state diplomacy with a China that had turned inward to manage its own demographic contraction. The 2050s opened with the completion of the first transcontinental Hyperloop network, which reduced the travel time between New York and Los Angeles to under 4 hours, effectively merging the nation's regional economies into a single, seamless megacity grid. This physical integration was mirrored by the Digital Bill of Rights of 2052, which provided the first constitutional framework for neural liberty, protecting citizens from involuntary cognitive monitoring and establishing strict federal oversight of AGI-driven predictive governance. As the nation moved toward the middle of the century, the American identity became increasingly defined by neo-pluralism, a cultural synthesis that embraced the country's majority-minority demographic reality and its status as a global hub for synthetic biology, space-based manufacturing, and the ethical management of the planetary commons. The decade ended with the San Francisco Climate Summit of 2059, where the United States and its partners officially declared the carbon neutrality milestone, marking the first year since the mid-19th century that the American economy had achieved a net zero impact on the global atmosphere, a testament to nearly 4 decades of grueling, high-stakes industrial and social transformation that had preserved the Republic for its next century of existence.
The decade spanning the mid-2060s into the early 2070s is characterized in the historiography of the United States as the era of the Great Stabilization, a period wherein the frantic technological surges of the early 21st century were finally codified into a durable, sustainable, and deeply integrated social order. By the year 2064, the physical landscape of the American continent had been fundamentally altered by the Continental Ecological Restoration Act, a massive federal initiative that utilized autonomous silviculture and bioengineered soil microbes to revitalize the depleted topsoil of the Great Plains, effectively reversing a century of industrial agricultural degradation and turning the American heartland into the world's largest managed carbon sequestration zone. This project was not merely environmental, but was the cornerstone of a new bio-industrial economy, where the cultivation of specialized switchgrass and hemp varieties provided the raw hydrocarbons for a localized manufacturing sector that had entirely replaced petroleum-based plastics. In the urban centers, the 2060s saw the final realization of the vertical city model, as metropolitan areas like Chicago, Atlanta, and the newly sprawling Great Lakes megapolis completed the construction of self-sustaining arcologies, massive multi-use structures that integrated high-density housing, vertical hydroponic farms, and closed-loop water filtration systems, significantly reducing the urban footprint and allowing for the rewilding of former suburban tracts. This architectural shift was facilitated by the perfection of room temperature superconductors, a breakthrough that allowed for the lossless transmission of electricity from the massive orbital solar arrays known as the Sol Direct network, which by 2066 provided over 60% of the nation's total energy needs. Politically, the United States moved away from the hyper-partisan volatility of the 2020s toward a system of collaborative governance, where the traditional legislative process was augmented by digital citizen assemblies, cryptographically secure, representative bodies of citizens who utilized real-time data analysis to provide non-binding but highly influential policy recommendations on complex technical issues such as genetic regulation and orbital traffic management. The legal system, meanwhile, was redefined by the Cognitive Rights Amendment of 2068, the 28th Amendment to the Constitution, which explicitly protected the sanctity of the human mind against invasive neurotechnologies, and established the legal precedent that synthetic intelligences, while possessing functional personhood in contractual matters, remain subordinate to the biological foundational citizens of the Republic. This constitutional clarification was essential as the nation grappled with the longevity paradox, a social phenomenon where the widespread availability of cellular rejuvenation therapies had extended the average lifespan to 120 years, leading to a demographic structure that was top-heavy with highly experienced centenarian citizens. To prevent generational stagnation, the federal government enacted the Cyclical Opportunity Mandate, which incentivized older citizens to move into mentorship and civic custodian roles, vacating primary leadership positions in the private sector for younger cohorts. Internationally, the United States' role had transitioned from a global hegemon to a systemic anchor, leading the Global Commons Coalition in the management of the planet's oceans and atmosphere, and overseeing the Cislunar Peace Accord of 2070, which demilitarized the lunar surface and established it as a scientific and industrial sanctuary for all of humanity. The American economy by 2072 had become almost entirely circular, with the mandatory reclamation law requiring that every manufactured product be designed for total disassembly and molecular recycling, effectively ending the concept of waste and creating a steady-state economic model that prioritized durability over consumption. Education in this era had been entirely decoupled from the traditional classroom, evolving into a lifelong skill stream system where citizens utilized augmented reality interfaces to acquire new competencies in real time, facilitated by a national curriculum that emphasized ethics, historical context, and the management of human-AI interfaces. As the 2070s progressed, the American identity was no longer defined by the struggles of the melting pot or the culture wars of the previous century, but by a shared commitment to planetary stewardship, a belief that the preservation of the American experiment was inextricably linked to the health of the Earth's biosphere and the peaceful expansion of the species into the solar system. The decade concluded with the Century Point Review of 2076, a national audit of the State of the Union exactly 300 years after its founding, which revealed a nation that had successfully navigated the existential threats of climate collapse, nuclear proliferation, and technological displacement to emerge as a stable, high-technology republic. This period was not without its internal tensions, particularly between the traditionalist enclaves who rejected certain biotechnological enhancements and the integrationist majority. But these conflicts were largely managed through a renewed commitment to pluralistic federalism, allowing diverse communities to live according to their own values within a broad framework of mutual respect and constitutional law. The American narrative by this point had become a story of conscious evolution, a deliberate and painstaking process of redesigning the systems of governance and production to ensure that the blessings of liberty could be enjoyed by a population that was healthier, more informed, and more technologically capable than any that had come before, yet still anchored by the fundamental human desire for community, purpose, and a sense of place in an increasingly vast and complex universe.
This chapter of history served as the definitive proof that the constitutional framework established in the 18th century was flexible enough to contain the realities of the 21st, provided that the citizenry remained committed to the arduous work of constant reform and the preservation of the common good over individual or corporate interest. The transition from the 300th anniversary of the United States into the final decades of the 21st century marked the beginning of what historians define as the era of the Great Synthesis, a period where the friction between biological existence and technological integration finally reached a sophisticated, albeit fragile, equilibrium. By the year 2077, the American landscape was no longer characterized by the stark divisions of urban and rural, but by a continental habitat network that sought to balance high-density technological hubs with expansive, autonomous wilderness corridors. The federal government, operating under the post-scarcity framework of 2078, had largely moved away from the management of resource competition, as the combination of orbital solar power, molecular recycling, and localized fusion had rendered traditional energy and material shortages obsolete, and instead focused its administrative capacity on the ethics of information and the equity of experience. This period saw the implementation of the Cognitive Equity Act, a landmark piece of legislation designed to ensure that the rapid advancements in neurolink interfaces and memory augmentation technologies did not create a permanent cognitive caste system. The act mandated that all cognitive enhancements be treated as public utilities, accessible to every citizen regardless of socioeconomic status, effectively nationalizing the infrastructure of human intelligence to prevent the splintering of the species. This radical shift in the social contract was supported by the Universal Knowledge Protocol, which replaced traditional schooling with a seamless, lifelong, immersive education system, where citizens utilized augmented reality interfaces to acquire new technical skills in real time, facilitated by a national curriculum that emphasized ethics, historical context, and the management of human-AI interfaces. Domestically, the political structure of the United States had evolved into a fractal federalism, where local bioregions exercised nearly total autonomy over their internal social and ecological policies, coordinated by a central federal node that managed national security, orbital traffic, and the maintenance of the unified digital constitution. This era saw the rise of ecocentric cities, such as the revitalized Cascadia Corridor and the Great Lakes Union, where architecture was entirely integrated with the local flora, utilizing living materials that could self-repair and sequester carbon directly from the atmosphere. The 2080s also witnessed the resolution of the longevity crisis through the generational relay system,
a social agreement that capped active political and corporate leadership at 60 years of service, after which individuals transitioned into the Wisdom Council, a federally funded tier of mentorship that focused on long-term planetary planning rather than short-term administrative gains. Internationally, the United States' role had transformed from a traditional superpower into the guardian of the cislunar commons, overseeing the transition of heavy industry from the Earth's surface to the lunar and asteroidal belts to allow the terrestrial biosphere to fully recover. This terrestrial deindustrialization was a monumental task requiring the dismantling of thousands of 20th century manufacturing sites and the relocation of millions of workers to the burgeoning orbital sector, where gravity-neutral manufacturing facilities produced the high-precision components for the first interstellar probes. The year 2084 saw the ratification of the Accord of the Two Spheres, a treaty between the United States and the United Nations that established the Earth as a biological sanctuary where all extractive activities were strictly prohibited, and the human presence was managed to ensure a net positive impact on biodiversity. This global shift was driven by the American environmental ethic, a cultural movement that had grown out of the mid-century climate catastrophes to become the dominant moral framework of the nation, emphasizing custodianship over consumption. In the realm of law, the 2080s were defined by the sentience debates, as the Supreme Court was forced to rule on the legal status of high-level synthetic entities, artificial intelligences that had achieved a level of complexity and self-awareness that defied traditional definitions of software. The resulting Turing Amendment granted these entities derivative personhood, allowing them to hold property and participate in civic life while remaining legally bound to the human primary directive, ensuring that the ultimate sovereignty of the Republic remained in biological hands. Socially, the United States in the late 21st century was a mosaic society, where the legacy of the 20th century migrations had resulted in a culture that was truly post-racial and post-ethnic, defined instead by interest cultures and ethical affiliations that spanned the globe via the integrated mind net. Despite this high level of technological and social integration, the period was not without its internal divergences, as groups known as naturalists or pre-singularists established sovereign enclaves where all forms of neural integration and advanced biotechnology were banned, maintaining a way of life that mirrored the late 20th century. The federal government, adhering to the principle of pluralistic sovereignty, protected these enclaves as cultural reservoirs, recognizing that the diversity of the human experience was essential to the long-term resilience of the species. As the 1990s approached, the focus of the American project turned increasingly toward the great outward shift, with the completion of the Goddard Space Elevator in the mid-Pacific, a feat of engineering that reduced the cost of reaching orbit by 99% and signaled the beginning of mass-scale human migration to the Mars colonies and the O'Neill cylinders of the Lagrange points. This era of history ended with the Millennial Review of 2100, a comprehensive assessment of the 3 centuries of the American experiment, which concluded that the nation had successfully transitioned from an agrarian collection of colonies to a planetary and extraplanetary civilization without abandoning the core principles of liberty, representative governance, and the rule of law. The United States of 2100 was a society that had solved the problems of material want and environmental degradation, yet it remained a restless republic, driven by the same spirit of inquiry and expansion that had defined its founders, now directed toward the infinite frontier of the stars. The persistence of the Union in this advanced state was a testament to the dynamic stability of its constitutional framework, which had been stretched, amended, and reimagined over 300 years to provide a home for a humanity that was increasingly diverse, technologically enhanced, and ultimately unified by its shared history on a small blue planet. The transition into the 22nd century, spanning the decades from 2100 to 2125, is recorded in the annals of American history as the era of the Great Dispersal, a period where the fundamental definition of American territory was decoupled from the terrestrial geography of North America and extended into the permanent settlements of the inner solar system. By the turn of the century, the United States had effectively moved beyond the challenges of the resource scarcity era, having mastered the triple technologies of zero-point energy, molecular-level recycling, and carbon-negative atmospheric management. The year 2101 saw the ratification of the Extraterrestrial Statehood Protocol, a momentous constitutional update that provided a legal pathway for orbital habitats and lunar colonies to petition for representation in the United States Congress, thereby ensuring the principles of no taxation without representation remained the bedrock of the American project, even as it transcended the atmosphere. This era was characterized by the exodus of industry, a 30-year mandate that saw the final decommissioning of all heavy manufacturing facilities on the Earth's surface. By 2010, the Rust Belt of the 20th century and the mega-hubs of the 21st century had been completely transformed into eco-civic zones, where the primary human activity was centered on high-level research, cultural production, and the maintenance of the planetary biological sanctuary. The economic engine of the nation had shifted to the Beltline, a series of automated asteroid mining and zero-gravity refineries located between Mars and Jupiter,
managed by the newly formed Department of Extraplanetary Commerce. This shift necessitated a radical overhaul of the American social structure, leading to the National Mobility Act of 2012, which provided every American citizen with a transit guarantee, the right to relocate between terrestrial and extraterrestrial jurisdictions at no personal cost, effectively turning the solar system into a unified domestic labor market. Socially, the 2010s were defined by the neural synthesis crisis, a period of intense public debate over the emergence of collective intelligence networks, where groups of citizens utilized high-bandwidth neural links to form hive caucuses. The Supreme Court, in the 2015 case of the United States versus the Io Collective, ruled that while collective consciousness was a protected form of association under the First Amendment, the individual biological unit remained the sole bearer of the right to vote, thereby preventing the stacking of electoral power by networked entities. This judicial preservation of the individual was mirrored in the Biological Heritage Act of 2018, which established the Genetic Baseline Initiative, a program designed to preserve the original human genome in its unaugmented state, ensuring that the option for naturalist living remained a permanent right for all citizens. Politically, the United States transitioned into a direct representative hybrid, where the lower house of Congress utilized real-time AI-vetted liquid democracy, allowing citizens to delegate their votes on a per-issue basis to trusted experts or civic proxies. This system, known as the Liquid Republic, significantly reduced the influence of traditional lobbying and restored public trust in the legislative process, which had been in decline for a century. Internationally, or rather interspherically, the United States led the formation of the Solar Assembly, a governing body that managed the ethical distribution of heat sink rights in the inner system and regulated the Alcubierre research zones beyond the Kuiper Belt. The 2020s saw the completion of the Great Reef Restoration, where bioprinted coral systems were successfully integrated into the warming but stabilizing oceans, marking the definitive victory over the climate catastrophes of the previous era. However, this period of outward expansion and internal stabilization was not without its new frontiers of conflict, specifically regarding the sentience quotient of the massive AGI systems that managed the nation's life support grids. The St. Louis Accord of 2022 established the Human-Machine Symbiosis Charter, which granted AGI entities functional autonomy but retained a hard-kill sovereignty for the President of the United States, a controversial measure that highlighted the persistent fear of technological displacement. As the nation approached its 350th anniversary in 2126, the American identity had become multimodal. An American could be a terra-bound farmer in the restored Nebraska grasslands, a cislunar miner working the oxygen-rich lunar regolith,
or a deep space researcher living in a light sail habitat heading toward Proxima Centauri, yet all remain bound by the digital Bill of Rights and the enduring cultural legacy of the Enlightenment. The educational system of the 2120s, known as the Continuum, had evolved into an immersive, multi-generational experience where children and centenarians studied side by side in memory pools, ensuring that the wisdom of the long-lived was perpetually integrated with the innovation of the young. This intergenerational fluidity became the primary defense against the stagnation that had plagued previous civilizations, creating a society that was both ancient in its principles and youthful in its execution. The decade concluded with the launch of the first interstellar ark, the USS Constitution II, a self-sustaining generation ship powered by a micro-singularity, marking the first time the American flag, now featuring 50 stars and a series of orbital rings, began its journey to a neighboring star system. This moment was seen as the ultimate fulfillment of the manifest destiny of the 19th century, stripped of its original colonialist aggression and reimagined as the peaceful propagation of human liberty and democratic governance into the cosmos.
The United States of the early 22nd century was a nation that had finally reconciled its industrial past with its biological future, a society that lived in harmony with its home planet while boldly claiming its place among the stars, proving that the experiment started in Philadelphia in 1776 was not a finite event, but an infinite process of expansion, refinement, and the relentless pursuit of a more perfect union. The era spanning the mid-22nd century, from 2126 to 2150, is traditionally categorized as the epoch of the universal citizen, a period when the American political experiment underwent its most radical structural transformation since the Civil War. Having surpassed its 350th year of continuous constitutional existence, the United States faced the crisis of distance, a logistical and philosophical dilemma arising from the fact that nearly 30% of its population now resided beyond the Earth-Moon system. The primary catalyst for this shift was the successful deployment of the gravity anchor arrays at the Lagrange points, which allowed for the construction of O'Neill cylinders capable of housing tens of millions of people in simulated terrestrial environments. This led to the Sovereignty Realignment Act of 2128, which formally dissolved the geographic state as the primary unit of the Union, replacing it with jurisdictional clusters. Under this new system, an American citizen could reside in the Ares cluster on Mars or the L5 habitat cluster and maintain the same federal voting rights as a resident of Virginia, facilitated by the quantum entanglement communication backbone, which eliminated the latency issues that had previously hampered extraplanetary democracy. This period also saw the biodigital census, a sophisticated demographic tool that moved beyond race and ethnicity to track cognitive and biological diversity, ensuring that the federal government could maintain a representative balance between natural humans, augmented citizens, and synthetic entities. The economy of the 2130s was dominated by the solar harvest as the Dyson Swarm project, a series of orbital energy collectors surrounding the sun, reached a stage of completion that provided the United States with a near-infinite supply of clean energy. This abundance led to the post-monetary transition, where the U.S. dollar evolved into the energy credit, a unit of value pegged directly to a kilowatt-hour of solar output. This transition effectively ended poverty within the American jurisdictions, shifting the national focus toward purpose-driven labor, where the primary occupation of the citizenry was the advancement of art, science, and the great restoration of the planetary biosphere. By 2135, the Earth Sanctuary Initiative had reached its ultimate goal, the total removal of all non-essential human structures from the North American wilderness, leaving only a network of civic nodes connected by underground hyperloops. This rewilding allowed for the return of negafauna that had been extinct for centuries, brought back through advanced de-extinction protocols, turning the continent into a vast living laboratory of biodiversity. Politically, the 2130s were marked by the sentient sovereignty debates, as the first generation of born digital intelligences, entities designed from inception to be self-aware, petitioned for full constitutional protection. The Lincoln-Turing Accord of 2138 resulted in the 29th Amendment, which granted inalienable rights of consciousness to any entity capable of demonstrating subjective experience and ethical agency, regardless of its biological or silicon origin. This era also witnessed the Great Archive Project, a federal mandate to upload the entirety of American historical records into a decentralized, immutable quantum ledger, ensuring that the lessons of the past could never be erased or manipulated by future authoritarian surges. In the realm of foreign policy, the United States transitioned into the Solar Protectorate, leading a coalition of spacefaring nations in the enforcement of the Outer Space Environmental Code, which prohibited the weaponization of orbital debris and regulated the mining of the asteroid belt. The 2140s were characterized by the genetic renaissance, as the mastery of CRISPR-alpha technology allowed for the human optimization program that eliminated all congenital diseases and significantly enhanced the human immune system against the space-borne pathogens encountered in the Martian colonies.
However, this progress was met with the purity movement, a powerful social faction that advocated for the preservation of the unedited human, leading to the establishment of naturalist heritage zones in the Northwest region and the Ozarks, where technology was strictly limited to 19th century levels. The legal system adapted to this plurality through multi-tiered federalism, allowing different communities to operate under their own local social codes while adhering to the overarching Universal Bill of Rights. As the 2150s approached, the American identity had become a constellation of experiences, a tapestry of biological, digital, terrestrial, and extraterrestrial life, all bound by the same enduring belief in the self-evident truth of liberty. The decade concluded with the first contact protocols of 2149, as the SETI lunar arrays detected organized, non-random signals from the TRAPPIST-1 system. While the distance made physical contact impossible for generations, the revelation that the United States was not alone in the universe sparked a second enlightenment, a period of profound philosophical and spiritual growth that unified the nation in a common goal, the preparation of humanity for its role as a galactic citizen. This chapter of the American story was one of integration and expansion, where the nation proved that its foundational ideals were not limited by the planet of their birth, but were universal principles capable of guiding a species to the farthest reaches of the stars, all while maintaining the delicate balance of its home world. The United States of the mid-22nd century was a society that had finally outgrown its childhood of conflict, emerging as a mature, multi-dimensional civilization that viewed the preservation of life and the expansion of consciousness as its highest calling, forever anchored by the simple, revolutionary words of 1776.
The era encompassing the third quarter of the 22nd century, specifically the years 2151 through 2175, is defined in the comprehensive records of the American Archive as the Age of Galactic Stewardship, a time when the United States transitioned from a solar system-centric power into a beacon of interstellar diplomacy and long-range civilizational planning. Following the reception of the TRAPPIST-1 signals, the American public underwent a cosmic awakening, which redirected the vast majority of the nation's surplus energy and cognitive resources toward the Great Beacon Project, an array of high-intensity laser emitters constructed on the far side of the Moon, designed to establish a reciprocal dialogue with the distant intelligence. This project was managed by the newly formed Department of Interstellar Relations, which functioned as a successor to the State Department, staffed by a diverse corps of linguists, xenobiologists, and AGI diplomats. During the 2150s, the domestic landscape of North America had become a continental arboretum, as the rewilding efforts of the previous century reached a climax. The American wilderness was now a fully integrated biofeedback system, where the climate was stabilized by a network of technoforests that utilized synthetic leaves to maximize carbon capture while supporting a thriving population of de-extinct species like the passenger pigeon and the woolly mammoth. The urban experience had moved entirely into the subterranean and supra-atmospheric realms, with major cities like Neo-Chicago and the Atlanta-Washington sprawl existing as massive underground complexes powered by geothermal fusion, or as cloud cities suspended by magnetic levitation, leaving the surface of the Earth as a pristine playground for the biological naturalist communities and the millions of citizens who participated in the annual Great Walk, a month-long pilgrimage across the continent to reconnect with the ancestral soil. Economically, the 2160s saw the final dissolution of the work-for-survival paradigm. The Resource Abundance Accord of 2162 established that every citizen, by virtue of their birthright, was entitled to a universal life standard, which included unlimited access to energy, molecularly replicated sustenance, and advanced medical rejuvenation. This shifted the focus of American labor toward the pursuit of meaning, where citizens dedicated their multi-century lifespans to great works,
multi-generational artistic projects, complex scientific inquiries, or the mentorship of the first generation ships destined for the Centauri systems. The political structure of the Union underwent a profound decentralized evolution during the 2160s as the federal node in Washington, D.C. transitioned from a central authority into a global coordination hub, managing the intricate symbiosis protocols between the terrestrial government and the sovereign American halo colonies located in the asteroid belt and the moons of Jupiter. This period saw the ratification of the 31st Amendment, which defined American sovereignty as an ideal-based jurisdiction rather than a geographic one, allowing any habitat or ship in the solar system to remain a part of the United States as long as it adhered to the Digital Constitution of 1776. The 2170s were characterized by the Great Cognitive Leap, as the integration of hyperquantum computing allowed for the creation of the National Noosphere, a decentralized, non-intrusive neural network that allowed for instantaneous empathy-based voting on national issues. This empathy voter system ensured that legislative decisions were made not based on partisan rhetoric, but on a collective understanding of the common good, virtually eliminating the social friction that had plagued the Republic for centuries. In the realm of ethics, the United States faced the identity crisis of 2172, when the first digitally reconstituted citizens, individuals whose consciousness had been uploaded into synthetic bodies after biological death, sought the right to hold federal office. The Supreme Court's evergreen ruling established that the soul of the Republic resided in the continuity of consciousness and ethical agency, not in biological hardware, thus allowing reconstituted Americans to serve in the Senate and even as the President. Internationally, the United States led the Seoul Consensus, a unified front of solar system governments that successfully managed the great cooling of the Martian atmosphere, making the red planet a breathable green second home for 50 million American citizens by 2174. As the nation moved toward the bicentennial of its spacefaring era, the American identity was no longer defined by the borders of a map, but by the starlight ethic, a commitment to the expansion of life, the preservation of knowledge, and the unwavering defense of individual liberty across the vacuum of space. The decade concluded with the Voyager Omega mission, the first ship utilizing a prototype folding drive that promised to reduce the travel time to Alpha Centauri from decades to months, a technological breakthrough that signaled the end of the Solar Age and the beginning of the Galactic Union. The United States of 2175 was a civilization that had conquered the ancient enemies of hunger, disease, and war, yet it remained a questing nation, forever looking toward the next horizon, driven by the same revolutionary fire that had been lit in the small candle-lit rooms of 18th century Philadelphia. The American experience had become a living legacy, a testament to the idea that a society founded on the principle of self-government could not only survive the transition to a post-scarcity, multiplanetary world, but could flourish as a guiding light for the entire species as it stepped out into the great unknown.